Welcome to True Echo, where real moments inspire, and powerful stories reveal the truth beneath the surface. Today's story is one of rejection, redemption, and a single soul-stirring performance that changed everything. Stay with us as we uncover how a street pianist humiliated by an elitist conductor became the name on everyone's lips. You expect me to perform with her? In front of royalty and the press? Maestro Victor Lang's voice sliced through the velvet air of the dressing room, each word sharp, brimming with contempt. The assistant conductor flinched, holding the program with trembling fingers. "Sir," he stammered, with the Parisian prodigy missing her flight and every replacement booked, she's the only one available." Victor turned sharply, his silver cufflinks catching the chandelier's light. TikTok sensations do not belong in a concert hall built on centuries of genius. This isn't some sidewalk slot on Bourbon Street. This is my stage. My orchestra. My name on every column. Outside, the buzz of the gala rippled through the marble halls of the Orpheum Conservatory like anticipation before a storm. Guests adorned in jewels and tuxedos fluttered from champagne to conversations, unaware that behind the walls of gold and mahogany, a battle for legacy was being waged. Inside a side room, Amara James sat on the edge of a finely upholstered chair that felt far too pristine to support her worn coat. Her fingers, calloused from years of playing upright pianos on cold sidewalks, rested in her lap. She hadn't asked to be here. A stranger with a business card and a quiet promise had brought her. A talent scout had caught her playing under a flickering street lamp in Jackson Square and whispered, "You belong somewhere bigger." She never expected the chance to come this soon, or in this way. But she felt it before she heard it. That shift in the air. Like thunder preparing its throat. And when the door creaked open, the assistant conductor stepped in, his eyes full of apology, and her hope withered before he could speak. "I understand," she whispered, standing with her spine tall even as her heart sank like a stone. She walked out the service exit, past a janitor who offered a nod, past memories she hadn't made yet, and stepped into the golden dusk of a city that had already broken her once. But instead of walking away, her feet carried her in a slow, circling path around the building. She didn't understand why. She just knew her fingers still ached to play. The lobby of the Orpheum was quiet, save for the soft clinking of champagne glasses and murmured conversations between donors lingering between sets. Tucked into the corner near the cloakroom stood a grand piano, more decor than instrument. It gleamed beneath a chandelier, polished but unplayed. Amara approached it cautiously. No one stopped her. No one even noticed at first. She sat, her coat still around her shoulders, her fingers brushing the keys like she was saying hello to an old friend. Then she began to play. Not with flourish. Not with fanfare. Just a simple melody. Gentle and aching. It began with a whisper of notes, a familiar old progression wrapped in a kind of sorrow that only came from someone who had learned music as survival. It caught the attention of a woman near the entrance, her wine glass halfway to her lips. Her brow furrowed slightly, and she turned. Then another guest noticed. And another. Soon, a small group had gathered in the marble space, drawn by something they couldn't name but couldn't ignore. She kept playing, unaware of the crowd forming behind her. This wasn't performance. This was confession. She played a piece she'd composed in her mind years ago, on a freezing night beneath the awning of a shuttered jazz bar, when her fingers were nearly too numb to move, and all she had to warm her was the memory of her mother's humming. The song had no name. But it held a life inside it. A tech assistant walking by stopped, then quickly pulled out his phone and began to record. Not because it was expected. Because it felt like if he didn't, the moment would slip through history's fingers. Inside the concert hall, Maestro Lang stood stiffly at the podium, preparing for the third movement. He was beginning to sense something was off. The room, once packed with patrons, was thinning. He saw it in the shadows at the back, the empty seats, the slight murmurs. He glared toward the exits but pressed on, baton slicing the air with mathematical precision. In the lobby, the crowd swelled. No one said a word. They didn't need to. The music was saying everything. A young girl, dressed in a blue gala dress, reached for her father's hand and whispered, "She sounds like sadness and hope at the same time." One by one, the crowd in the concert hall began to trickle out, quietly, respectfully, but undeniably drawn to the music echoing just beyond the gilded double doors. And backstage, whispers erupted. "She's the girl who plays Chopin blindfolded outside Café du Monde. Is that the same Amara James from the street? Victor Lang threw her out. I saw it happen." The tension began to bubble beyond containment. Elaine Quarter, the prestigious chairwoman of the Children's Music Fund and the organizer of the gala, was among the last to leave her seat in the main hall. She had heard enough of the maestro's program for one evening. But it was the hush that greeted her in the lobby, the stillness of people holding their breath, that made her pause. And then she saw her. A young woman, alone at the piano, pouring her soul through every note. The music was raw, unpolished in the traditional sense, but it was alive. Amara wasn't just playing. She was transforming the space around her. Elaine's heart stuttered. She had seen hundreds of performances. But nothing like this. It wasn't about technical perfection. It was about truth. She stepped forward, slowly, hands clasped together. A child clapped once, then twice. The applause grew, first polite, then full, real, thunderous. Amara stopped, startled. She hadn't played for applause. She'd played to survive the ache. Elaine reached her just as the last note dissolved in the marble air. "What's your name, dear?" she asked softly. Amara stood, voice trembling. "Amara James." Elaine smiled with quiet purpose. "Would you honor us by closing tonight's gala, on the main stage?" At that moment, the double doors opened violently. Victor Lang entered, red with confusion and barely concealed fury. He took in the crowd, the girl at the piano, and Elaine's presence beside her. "What is this?" he snapped. "Elaine, what is going on?" Elaine turned to him without blinking. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "She's what's going on, Victor. She's who your audience came to hear." Victor's jaw clenched. "She has no pedigree. No credentials. You don't just put an amateur on the stage of the Orpheum." Elaine's voice cooled into steel. "She's not an amateur. She's an artist. And tonight, she reminded us all that talent is not confined to classrooms and conservatories." Victor looked around the lobby, at the hundreds of guests, many of them major donors, all nodding, many teary-eyed. His grip on authority was slipping. "I won't allow it," he said tightly. Elaine stepped closer. "You don't have a say. The program has changed." Victor's breath hitched. The control he'd wielded for decades, through his reputation, his arrogance, his flawless execution, was crumbling. And it was being undone by a girl he hadn't even allowed to speak. Amara didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked past him, toward the doors of the concert hall now wide open, the stage visible at the far end. She turned to Elaine. "I'm ready." And without another word, she walked forward. Victor Lang stood motionless, unable to speak, as Amara James passed him, no longer a street performer begging for permission, but an artist walking toward her stage. The stage at the Orpheum Conservatory had never known someone like Amara. As she stepped out under the blinding glow of chandelier light, her footsteps echoed across polished wood floors once reserved for laureates, prodigies, and masters of the classical elite. The orchestra, Victor's orchestra, sat frozen in silence. Some musicians exchanged bewildered glances, but most simply waited. Watching. She walked with grace, not grandeur. Her coat was still draped over her shoulders, her shoes were scuffed, and her hands bore the markings of work, not privilege. Yet she moved like she belonged, because the music inside her did. Elaine Quarter stood at the edge of the curtains, heart pounding, breath shallow. She had taken a risk, and for the first time in her decades of chairing these events, she didn't feel sure. But as Amara approached the piano at center stage, set beside the orchestra's front, something happened. A hush. Not from the absence of sound, but from the presence of meaning. Victor Lang, now seated in the fourth row with arms crossed tightly across his chest, watched with a storm brewing behind his eyes. He refused to move, refused to clap, refused to acknowledge the shift that was already happening. But inside, something else stirred, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years, uncertainty. Amara sat. The grand piano before her gleamed, untouched since rehearsal. It was perfectly tuned, perfectly balanced. She closed her eyes and let her fingers hover, just for a moment. And then she began. The first note was not bold, not sweeping. It was quiet. Almost too quiet. But it demanded attention, not because of its volume, but because of its honesty. The melody rose like a memory. A fragile, trembling thing. It wasn't in the program. It didn't need to be. It was a song she had written, half in her head, half in the cold, years ago. A piece formed in subway tunnels, church basements, and the back alley of a jazz club where broken hearts left their echoes. It was not structured in the way the symphony expected, but it breathed. It bled. The orchestra did not play. Not yet. They didn't have to. Amara's music filled every crevice of the hall with something larger than sound. It was the sound of hunger, of waiting, of being told no so many times that her yes had to be sung from her bones. Her fingers moved like she wasn't just playing notes, she was giving voice to a girl who had once sat in the cold, wondering if the world would ever hear her. And the world was listening now. In the third row, a woman lowered her opera glasses and whispered to her husband, "She's not performing, she's testifying." A man nearby wiped tears from beneath gold-rimmed spectacles. Then, without cue or command, the cellos joined. Soft. Hesitant. Reverent. They didn't have the sheet music. They weren't reading notes. They were following her. Playing by feel. The violinists glanced at one another, then followed, and in seconds, the orchestra, Victor's orchestra, began to accompany a song none of them had rehearsed, composed by a woman they hadn't known an hour ago. It should have been chaos. It became harmony. Amara didn't look at them. She didn't lead them. She simply trusted them to understand. And somehow, they did. Backstage, a sound technician whispered, "It's like she's not just playing to them. She's pulling it out of them." The melody evolved. It deepened. Swelled. Then, in one seamless, impossible moment, Amara transitioned into a theme no one expected. A melody so intimate, so buried, that it froze Victor Lang in place. He knew it. Every note. Every pause. Every breath. It was his. A piece he had written 10 years ago in the wake of his wife's death. A lamentation never performed, never published. It had only been played once, on a cold night in New Orleans, when he was drunk and grieving, and sat alone on a bench outside the cathedral. A young street musician had been nearby. He barely remembered her. Now, she was giving it back. She hadn't stolen it. She hadn't mimicked it. She understood it. And she played it not with mockery, but mercy. Victor couldn't breathe. It was like watching a ghost kneel beside him and offer forgiveness. His chest tightened. His hands, which once held thousands in rapt attention, now trembled in his lap. And in that moment, Victor Lang, the maestro, the legend, the gatekeeper, knew. The baton had passed. Not with ceremony. Not with applause. But with the sound of something greater than technique, truth. Amara's piece climbed to its final swell. The orchestra, sensing her movement like breath, followed her rise. Together, they reached the summit, Not loud, not grandiose, but clear. Open. Then came the last chord. Held. Suspended. And released, like the closing of a prayer. Silence followed. No rustle. No cough. Just reverence. Then, a clap. 1. Then 3. Then a roar. Not polite applause. Not formal admiration. But a thunderous, unrestrained ovation that shook the chandeliers and echoed like a wave of thunder. Amara stood slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She bowed, once, and looked out over the crowd. Not searching for approval, but acknowledging what had just passed between them. Behind her, the orchestra stood too. Not because they were told, but because they had to. Elaine walked to the center of the stage, her voice barely carrying over the ovation. "This," she said, "is why music must never be confined to those already inside the gates. Because the soul knows no pedigree. Only purpose." She turned to Amara and added, "You don't just belong here. You've redefined what here means." And as the curtain slowly lowered behind them, Victor Lang remained in his seat, still, breathless, humbled. Victor Lang didn't move. Not for several minutes after the curtain fell. The crowd had begun to disperse, murmurs rippling like aftershocks through the grand concert hall. Words like astonishing, raw, and once in a lifetime clung to the marble as tightly as perfume. But Victor sat alone, lost in a sound that had long since faded from the air, but not from him. That melody. His melody. She'd found it buried in the quiet. He didn't know whether to feel violated or vindicated. All he knew was that Amara James had pulled something out of him he thought had died. Eventually, he rose, slowly, like a man recovering from injury. No one approached him. No one stopped him. He walked through the corridor like a shadow, through applause he hadn't earned, past portraits he no longer recognized, back into the silence of his private lounge. He poured a glass of scotch but didn't drink it. He stared into the glass like it might answer the questions screaming in his chest. Who was she? What had he become? Backstage, Amara sat in a dressing room that still felt surreal. A staffer had rushed to set it up for her, flowers, a nameplate hastily written in marker, bottles of water with gold foil tops. She was alone for a moment, just her and the quiet. She placed her hands on the vanity, palms flat, as if steadying herself against the gravity of what had just happened. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Elaine entered, her smile warm and proud. "They want to meet you," she said. "Not just the donors. The musicians. The board. Even some of the critics are waiting outside. You changed something tonight." Amara looked down at her worn shoes. "I didn't mean to take anything away from anyone." Elaine's smile faded into something more solemn, more honest. "You didn't take, Amara. You gave. You reminded us that music was never meant to be owned." Outside the dressing room, the atmosphere was electric. Musicians buzzed with excitement, donors leaned in close to catch every whisper about the mysterious pianist. Phones buzzed with news alerts and social media clips. One video of Amara's impromptu lobby performance had already hit over 500,000 views. She stepped out slowly. The hallway parted for her like a sea. "Miss James," someone asked. "Would you consider a recording contract? We'd love to discuss a residency." "You should teach here," said one of the junior instructors. But Amara wasn't thinking about contracts or commissions. Her eyes were scanning the crowd, her breath shallow. Then, she spotted him. Victor. Standing near the far end of the corridor, alone, no baton in sight. Just a man. Not a maestro. Not a legend. Their eyes met. He approached, carefully. The room quieted instinctively. "Amara," he said. Just her name. As if he wasn't sure he deserved to say more. Maestro, she replied, calm, measured. He shook his head. I don't think I've earned that title tonight. Amara didn't respond. She let him sit in a discomfort he had never allowed himself before. I was wrong, he finally said. Not just about you. About everything. The music, the legacy, the meaning of the stage. I've spent years mistaking control for excellence. He swallowed. What you did out there, it reminded me why I started. Before the awards. Before the authority. I used to play for joy. I used to listen. She tilted her head slightly. What changed? I did. Or maybe I just forgot. A silence stretched between them. Victor reached inside his coat and pulled something out, a small, worn wooden baton, the handle smooth from decades of use. He held it between them, reverently. I don't conduct anymore. But if you're willing, I'd like to pass this on. Not as an endorsement. Not as redemption. But as a symbol. A reminder. Of what music can be. Amara stared at it. Her fingers twitched. She reached out, but didn't take it. Not yet, she said quietly. Maybe someday. Victor nodded slowly. And then he did something no one had seen him do in years. He bowed. Not just his head. His whole body. A bow of humility, of thanks, of passing the torch. The silence afterward was sacred. Elaine stepped forward, her eyes glistening. Amara, we've never done this before, but I'd like to offer you something. Amara turned. A 1-year residency, Elaine said. Full creative control. You choose the pieces. You mentor our students. You compose if you want. All of it. We fund it. No strings. Amara blinked, stunned. Why me? Elaine smiled. Because you reminded us that music without truth is just noise. And tonight? You gave us silence we felt. Amara didn't respond. Not with words. She reached out slowly and took the baton from Victor's hand. Not with triumph. But with purpose. The next morning felt like the world had exhaled. Amara woke in her small apartment, the morning sun stretching long arms across her sheets. Her hands ached faintly, the good kind of ache, the kind that let her know the night before hadn't been a dream. She sat up slowly, blinked against the light, and turned to her bedside table. The baton Victor had given her lay there. She hadn't meant to take it home. In fact, she'd forgotten it was still in her pocket until she unlocked her front door hours earlier and felt its weight, small, but full of something vast and unspoken. It hadn't been a gift. It had been a gesture. One she now realized meant something even more than he had likely intended. Her phone buzzed against the dresser. She reached for it and was met with a wall of notifications. Mentions. Tags. Messages. A video clip from the concert hall had gone viral overnight, her playing, the orchestra rising to meet her, and that haunting melody. Victor's melody. The caption read, "A street pianist stole the spotlight, and gave us something better." The comments flooded in like a wave. This is the first time music made me cry in years. Who is she? Where has she been hiding? The girl from Jackson Square just rewrote what classical music means. She set the phone down, overwhelmed. It wasn't the attention that startled her. It was the love. So much of her life had been spent in silence or dismissal. Now, the world was not just listening, they were hearing her. Later that day, Amara returned to the Orpheum, not for a performance, but to begin her residency. Elaine had arranged for her to have a studio, modest, sunlit, with a baby grand piano tucked near the window. The keys were warm beneath her fingers, as if they recognized her. On the far wall, a quote had been etched into a bronze plaque, newly mounted since that morning. Truth in sound. A.J. She stared at it for a long time. Her initials. Her truth. Permanently part of this place now. As she unpacked a few worn notebooks and a scarf her mother had once knitted, there was a soft knock at the door. A student stood there, maybe 16, holding a binder and looking nervous. "Miss James?" Amara stood. "I heard you might be teaching some of the open classes. I wanted to ask if you'd show me how you do it. Not the notes. The other part. The part where it feels real." Amara smiled softly. She remembered being that age, desperate for someone to just show her the way forward. "Come in," she said. "Close the door behind you." Word spread quickly. Within a week, she had a waiting list of students. Not because she promised prestige or perfection, but because she taught differently. She didn't tell them to perform. She asked them, "What are you trying to say that you can't say with words?" That question broke something open in them. Some cried. Some played music no one had ever heard before. And every time, Amara listened, not just to the notes, but to the ache between them. Meanwhile, across the conservatory, Victor Lang kept mostly to himself. He was still part of the board, still carried his titles. But something in him had quieted. He no longer corrected people. He no longer spoke over them. He listened. One afternoon, Elaine found him sitting quietly in the back of a rehearsal room, eyes closed, hands folded. "She's teaching them to feel," he said, before Elaine could even speak. "Not just to perform. That's something I forgot how to do." Elaine sat beside him. "You didn't forget. You buried it. She just helped you remember." That evening, Amara sat at the piano in her studio, alone. The city lights blinked beyond the window. The air was thick with possibility. She pulled out a blank page and wrote 2 words at the top. Inheritance. It would be her first full orchestral composition. Her story told in movement and measure. Not just her pain, but her becoming. The melody came slowly at first, hesitant, like it wasn't sure it was allowed. Then it swelled. Grew. Took shape. It carried echoes of subway trains, the rhythm of coins in a tin cup, the sound of her mother's voice humming as she stirred a near-empty pot. It was not a lament. It was a celebration. A map of survival. A sonnet of defiance. By midnight, the first draft was complete. She stared at it for a long while, hand pressed to the paper, as if grounding herself in what she had made. The music was no longer about proving anything. It was about building a door, one that others like her could walk through. She sent the composition to Marco Levant, the new conductor for the Philharmonic. It was titled, simply, Inheritance, for all those who were told no. Marco Levant sat in his office, the morning sun painting amber lines across the polished desk as he read through Amara's composition. He wasn't a man easily impressed. As the youngest conductor in the conservatory's history, he had seen ego dressed as innovation more times than he could count. But what lay before him, scrawled in pencil and passion, was different. It was alive. Inheritance didn't follow the traditional movements of a symphony. It rose and fell like breath. Like memory. It held a tenderness in its silence and a quiet rage in its swells. It was classical in form but unrepentantly modern in voice. And most astonishing of all, it trusted the listener. At rehearsal that afternoon, Amara stood before the orchestra for the first time, not as a soloist, not as a guest, but as conductor. The baton Victor Lang had once held rested in her hand. It felt strange at first, unfamiliar in its weight. But her grip was steady. Not commanding. Inviting. The musicians, some of whom had been under Victor's baton for decades, watched her closely. Not skeptically. Curiously. She raised her arm, took a breath, and whispered, "Let's begin." The first run-through was rough around the edges, some mistimed entrances, a few uncertain transitions, but the essence of it was unmistakable. The music held them. It asked them to listen differently, to feel more than they played. And they responded in kind. By the third rehearsal, something had clicked. They weren't just playing her music. They were inside it. Ezra, a gifted violinist with quiet confidence, leaned over during a break and said, "I've never played something that made me feel like I was praying and screaming at the same time." Amara laughed softly. "That's probably because I wrote it that way." In the days that followed, the conservatory buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread, Amara James, the miracle from the gala, was premiering a new original work to close the winter season gala. Not just performing it, conducting it. Critics clutched their pens. Alumni booked flights. Students sat in on rehearsals just to witness history being made. Even Victor Lang returned, quietly, in the back row, his notebook on his knee but his pen unmoving. He didn't take notes anymore. He listened. Then came the final dress rehearsal. Amara stood at the podium, the lights of the empty hall glowing like ghosts. The orchestra sat before her, ready, hearts open. She lifted her baton, but paused. "I'm going to take a rest during the middle movement," she said calmly. "I won't cue you. I want you to carry it." A murmur rippled through the players. "You want us to play without you?" Ezra asked, confused. Amara nodded. "Just for those 10 measures. You'll know when. Trust the piece. Trust each other." It was unconventional. Bold. Risky. But when the music reached that moment, and she lowered her arms, the orchestra didn't falter. They rose. The sound grew not louder, but more human. As if the absence of leadership had summoned something deeper. Each player became responsible for the others. It was not chaos, it was communion. And Amara watched, still, tears stinging her eyes. They were playing her story. And making it theirs. On the night of the gala, the Orpheum Conservatory glowed brighter than ever. The crowd filed in wearing silk and sparkle, but there was an edge to the air, an expectation, a kind of reverent tension. They weren't here to be dazzled. They were here to be moved. Backstage, Amara stood in front of a mirror. She wore a simple black gown, no sequins, no jewels. Just elegance, quiet and powerful. Around her neck, her mother's music note pendant rested gently against her skin. Miles entered with a bouquet of wild sunflowers and a grin that looked like it had been waiting 20 years to bloom. "Don't say anything," she whispered, already emotional. "I wasn't gonna," he lied. Then he added softly, "But Mom would have lost her mind tonight." She nodded, breathing through the lump in her throat. Out in the hall, the audience hushed as Marco Levant took the stage. "Tonight," he said to the crowd, "we close our season not with a familiar classic, but with a new voice. One that reminds us that the future of music lies not in tradition alone, but in the truth we dare to tell." He stepped back. And Amara walked out. The applause was polite at first, then surged when they saw her. The miracle from the street. The woman who turned rejection into revelation. She raised her baton. And the music began. The first notes of Inheritance rose like breath in cold air, fragile, unsure, beautiful. Strings shimmered like snowfall. The piano entered softly, a student of Amara's playing with trembling grace, her hands guided by something deeper than instruction. The audience leaned in. Then came the swell. A rising tension that mirrored the way life presses against the ribs, too much to hold, too urgent to ignore. And just as it reached its breaking point, Amara stepped back. Lowered her arms. And let them play. The silence of her stillness was thunderous. And the music? It soared. Unbound. Unled. Unafraid. By the final crescendo, the room felt like it might split open from the weight of so much truth. And when it ended, no one moved. The final note hovered, quivered, and then faded like breath on glass. Silence. Holy. Whole. Then. Applause. Not just standing. Not just thunderous. Eruptive. Tears. Laughter. Hands clutching chests like hearts had forgotten how to beat until that moment. Amara bowed. Not deeply. Just enough. Then motioned to the orchestra. They stood with her. All of them. Even Victor. The standing ovation lasted so long it blurred into something else, into awe, into surrender, into gratitude. Amara stood quietly at the center of it, not basking, but steady. Her posture didn't scream, "Look at me." It whispered, "We made it." Beside her, the young pianist, Amara's student, clutched the edge of the grand piano, teary-eyed and stunned. The orchestra had never sounded so alive, not even under Victor Lang. Because this wasn't about precision anymore. It was about permission. Backstage, Elaine Quarter clutched the side curtain, her knuckles white with emotion. She had been to over 100 gala performances in her life. None had ever made her weep like this. None had ever felt like this, like a door opening, not just for one woman, but for an entire generation. When Amara exited the stage, the applause still roaring behind her, she was met by Miles, arms open, eyes wet. He didn't speak. Just wrapped her in the tightest hug she'd ever felt. "They heard you," he whispered. "They finally heard you." Amara nodded, breath shaking. "It's not just my voice anymore." Moments later, the corridor parted again. Victor Lang walked forward slowly, not dressed in a tux, but in a dark sweater and slacks. He looked more like someone's grandfather than the maestro who had once silenced rooms with a flick of his wrist. She turned toward him. He stopped a few feet away, hands folded. For a long moment, they said nothing. "I've spent my life believing the baton gave me control," Victor said finally. "But tonight, you showed me it can also set things free." She tilted her head slightly. "You weren't wrong to love the stage. You were wrong to think it only belonged to you." Victor smiled. Not bitterly. Peacefully. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "That melody," he said carefully, voice rough with memory. "The one you gave back to me at the gala. How did you remember it?" "It was never written. I only played it once." Amara's eyes softened. "I didn't remember it. I felt it. You played it near the cathedral one night, years ago. You didn't know I was there. But I heard it. And I never forgot." His throat tightened. "I wrote that piece the week my wife died. I called it nothing. Just grief. You made it beautiful." "It already was," she said gently. "It just needed to be heard." Victor stepped forward and opened his hand. In his palm was a small envelope, creased and unassuming. "I was going to retire quietly. But now I want to leave something behind the right way." She opened it. Inside was a short letter. A recommendation, hand-signed, from Victor Lang himself, endorsing her for the International Modern Music Summit in Vienna as both composer and conductor. A global audience. A stage where history was written, not repeated. Her breath caught. "You deserve to speak," he said. "Let the world listen." Weeks passed. And the buzz didn't fade. It deepened. Articles called her the sound of a new era. Reviewers stopped describing her technique and started describing her effect. Not just how she played, but how she changed people. At the conservatory, she wasn't just a guest anymore. She was a pillar. Students gathered in her studio every week, not just to learn chords or fingering, but to ask questions like, "How do I put my fear into the music?" She told them, "You don't tame your fear. You translate it." She conducted. She taught. She composed. But most of all, she listened. And then one morning, as snow fell lightly outside her studio window, Elaine arrived carrying a plaque wrapped in black cloth. A small crowd had gathered, faculty, students, donors. Elaine looked at her with something like maternal pride. "Today we dedicate this space," she announced, "not to a legacy of perfection, but to a legacy of truth." She pulled the cloth away. The Amara James Studio for Truth in Sound. Below it, "Music is what we remember when words forget us." Applause followed, but quiet, reverent. Not celebration. Communion. Amara touched the plaque, fingertips lingering. Not to claim it, but to thank it. That night, she returned to Jackson Square. The same corner. The same crooked bench. The same upright piano missing a few teeth but still holding warmth. She sat, not to perform. Not to impress. Just to play. A few tourists slowed their steps. A father with his daughter paused nearby. The little girl tugged his sleeve. "Who is that?" she asked. The father smiled gently. "I don't know. But she plays like she's telling a secret." And she was. Every note said. "You are not too small. You are not too late. You are not too broken. You don't need permission. Because the world doesn't need another echo. It needs your voice." Amara's story isn't just about talent. It's about truth. It's about what happens when someone refused to shrink themselves for the comfort of tradition, and in doing so, gave everyone else permission to grow. She didn't wait to be chosen. She chose herself. And maybe that's what greatness really is, not being invited to the table, but building a new one, where everyone gets a seat. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of someone who's ever been overlooked, subscribe to True Echo. We bring you powerful stories like this every week, stories that speak not to perfection, but to purpose. Leave us a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to remember, they already belong.